So, hi everyone. My name is Chloe Legendre. I'm from Netflix, a research organization there, and I'm going to be presenting. This was a paper talk we presented at DigiPro, which was co-located with this year's Siggraph. The paper is called Jointly Optimizing Color Rendition and In-Camera Backgrounds in an RGB Virtual Production Stage. And you'll notice I looked over to read it because it's a long title and I wanted to make sure I get it right. So this is work with my co-authors, Lucas Lepikovsky from Scanline VFX, as well as Paul Debevec, also from Netflix and a colleague there. So today we're going to be talking about a different application of virtual production than the one that you're seeing me in right now. So right now you're seeing me against a virtual background, but we're going to be talking about a slightly different use case, not just the in-camera background filming, but the one where you're actually using the LED panels not as a background, but rather as illumination. So in this case, we're seeing Sandra Bullock here being surrounded by an entire box of LED panels. And these are being used to drive real-world illumination that's being used to light her here so that we've got realistic composites that make it look like she was actually in this scene. So this is an example of the technique that's called lighting reproduction, which was introduced by Paul at a Siggraph long ago, at Siggraph in 2002. This work was a lighting reproduction approach to live-action compositing, and here the actors were surrounded by photographed high dynamic range lighting environments, or they were lit by using the light of a virtual set. So this was pretty cool, and back in 2002, Paul and team were using a 3-channel color kinetics light source, which was made up of red, green, and blue LEDs. And these are not actually all that different from the LEDs that are used in today's virtual production stages. So this is a close-up view through a macro lens. We're seeing now an individual LED unit, which is made up of a red, a green, and a blue diode at each pixel. And in the interim 20 years that have passed between these the original technique and the current technique, the main thing that's happened in the LED display world is that they've really been optimized for their use as displays. And this is a shot that I pulled of Times Square, which really shows them in all their glory operating as displays. So when you're building a display, one thing that you might care about is being able to produce a lot of different colors. So when you're looking at using an LED panel as a display, you might care about having a wide color gamut. And so if you want to start out by thinking about, well, what does this actually mean from a color science perspective, you can go ahead and click. We're going to start out with the simplest use case, which is we've got 3 monochromatic lasers that are going to be used to form our color primaries. And they're going to fall right on what's called the spectral locus, which is like the exterior edge of this horseshoe-shaped plot. And you can see them going there. And this is great. If you use these as your primaries, you're going to be able to create quite a wide gamut. So if you can click the next one, please. You're going to be able to form all the colors that lie within this nice triangle that you're seeing on the plot. And this is a relatively wide gamut. Next. However, if you're using LEDs, slightly wider peaks. And this is not as great as you might want from a color science perspective, because if you go to the next one, you'll see that because these have wider spectra, you're not able to produce quite as many colors using these as your illuminants. And so that means that, yeah, your triangle is going to get smaller. You can't produce as many colors. So what does this actually mean for us when we're thinking about displays? Next. If we want to make displays that can show a lot of different colors, we want to have a wide color gamut, which means that we want to prefer to have narrow emission spectra. Okay, this makes sense. You can go to the next slide. The other thing we might want to consider when we're making displays is that for the red primary, the closer we get into the longer wavelength range near infrared, the more colors we're actually going to be able to include within this gamut. And similarly for blue, if you get closer to the short wavelength range, you're also going to be able to produce more colors as well. And so the triangle is actually going to get larger as your primaries move kind of closer to the extremes on the spectral locus. And if you could click the next button, that means that for wider color gamut displays, you'd rather have your blue be near UV and your red be near IR. And as we'll see, this may be as good from a display perspective, but might not be so great when you're looking at lighting. Next. Okay, so we've seen, okay, if you're using RGB LEDs as displays, narrow spectra means you can make more colors within that triangle and that gamut, and that's great. But now in the virtual production case, we are looking at using RGB LEDs as light sources because we're talking about surrounding our actors with these panels. And so what do these narrow spectra actually mean in this case? Next slide. Unfortunately, what we end up with in this case is we end up with bad color rendition when we're using these RGB LEDs as light sources. And here we have an example of Paul, who's here in the audience, wearing a brightly colored Hawaiian shirt, and he's in three very different lighting environments. So he's outside in the sun and in the shade, as well as under a fluorescent source. And you can see that the color of his Hawaiian shirt basically looks the same in all of these three different environments. But if we look at Paul now inside an RGB LED stage, we can see a big shift in the red tones of the shirt. The reds the orange tones of the shirts, they now appear red, and then Paul's skin tone, which is kind of a normal skin tone on the left images, now looks very pink-like, and Paul refers to himself here as the lobster man. So not a good look under the RGB LED based illumination. So these were images that we captured using an iPhone, but we wanted to get a bit more scientific with our approach here. So we went out and we measured our color checker chart, taking photographs in these 4 different lighting environments, and we also measured the spectra as well, as you can see here on the bottom, so definitely very different spectra. Now, if we zoom in and we look at these closely, we can see that the sunlight, the shade, and the fluorescent color rendition for these 3 charts all looks pretty similar. But now if we look at the RGB LED, I'll point out that the oranges here appear far more red, and the red square appears far brighter, and the skin tone squares appear much more pink. So this was consistent with what we saw of those images of Paul we captured with the iPhone. So what's really happening here is that we are unfortunately missing light in this very important region between 550 and 600 nanometers, between the green and the red part of the LED emission spectra. And that means that we just aren't having any light that's produced. So for orange and yellow materials, this becomes a problem. Now, if I overlay this with the orange reflectance spectrum, so this is the orange square of a color checker chart, you'll see that, yes, we are missing light in this very important region. And then the other thing that we're seeing here is that because the red is actually so high, we're seeing that, we're actually seeing more red that's being introduced here as well. So this also poses a problem for skin tones. Here we're seeing darker skin tones appearing more red under our RGB illumination compared with under natural lighting. And it's a problem for lighter skin tones as well, where you can see the subject's skin becoming more pink, which is consistent with what we saw of the image of Paul before. The other interesting thing that's happening here is that skin starts to reflect more and more light as you get closer into the IR range of light, so like the near IR range of the visible spectrum. And so that's where we end up seeing more and more of the red color on inside our virtual production stages. Okay. And so what that means is that when we're using these LED panels, which have really been designed and optimized to have these wide color gamuts because they've been historically used as displays, when we're using them now as light sources, because of these wide gamuts, we're now basically seeing poorer color rendition when we're using them as lighting. So one solution to this might be, you could imagine, okay, well, we just saw that there was that spectral gap between red and green, and that's what's partially responsible for this color rendition error. We could imagine building light sources that have more spectral channels. So you could imagine adding other spectral channels besides RGB. And Paul worked on a project in 2003 where they did exactly this. So they built a 9-channel multispectral light source specifically for the goal of improving color rendition, and it worked pretty well in practice. And if you go to the next slide, you'll see that when we were at USC ICT, we were able to build a multispectral light stage that had 6 spectral channels. So in addition to RGB, we added amber and cyan and a broad spectrum white to fill in these gaps. And using this approach, we were able to improve the color rendition when using these LED stage like this as a lighting instrument. However, a lot of these RGB-only panel systems, like the one that I'm sitting in front of, are around. And so we wanted to ask ourselves, especially when we got to Netflix, how can we leverage this kind of hardware without having to actually build custom hardware, like in this light stage example you're seeing here? So we want to assume there's no hardware changes, but what can we actually do to improve the color rendition when we're using these RGB LEDs as lighting? It's one thing to sit up here and complain and say, hey, well, we're not getting good color rendition out of these instruments, but we actually want to be able to solve this problem as well so that we can continue to shoot inside virtual production stages and be successful with that. So to start out with, we should talk about what's typically done right now to calibrate a virtual production stage for in-camera VFX. So the first thing that you want to do is ensure linearity, meaning that a pixel value that's twice as another produces twice as much light when it's displayed on the panel. The next thing that you want to do is you want to measure your primary. So you want to take your motion picture camera and you want to look at the panel producing red light, pure red light, whatever the LED primary is, then pure green and pure blue. And then from these measurements, you want to compute a pre-correction matrix. Now, the job of this pre-correction matrix is to make it so that a red pixel that's displayed by the panel actually appears that color to the camera. So 111 looks as close as possible to, or 100 looks as close as possible to 100. And of course, the same thing would hold for green and blue as well. And you're going to do this by solving for a 3x3 correction matrix, which is going to be applied to the content before it's displayed on the panels. And so this is the typical approach of what's done to calibrate a stage like this now. A nice property about this is that if red, green, and blue look correct to your camera, then all of the other colors, including white, will look correct as well, because these are the primaries. And so you kind of get that for free, which is lovely. If you're interested in further details of calibrating your virtual production stage for in-camera backgrounds, I have 3 resources that you can check out. One of them is Paul's original paper from 2002 that introduced lighting reproduction. Unreal Engine has an excellent kind of white paper guide. The link is here, but you can also just search color calibration in camera VFX and Unreal as a keyword, and it'll show up. And then our colleagues from Netflix introduced at this year's Siggraph an open source tool called OpenVPCal that helps you do this calibration, color calibration for in-camera VFX. So this was Monday morning, so sorry the current crowd missed that talk, but it was recorded. So if you have your Siggraph badge, you can, your full access, you can go check it out. Now, this is all fabulous and it works really well if your goal is to get great color rendition for your in-camera background. But again, what we've been talking about is using the panels as light sources. And so we'll move on to the next slide. And you can see that even if you properly perform all of that in-camera background color calibration, you're still going to get these color rendition errors like you can see for Paul's shirt. So this is actually taken on a calibrated RGB virtual production stage. So, costume designers, take heed. Maybe don't include these orange and yellow materials in your costumes, or at least, be cognizant of what needs to happen. You can go to the next slide. So in all of that, what I just showed, we were talking about using a pre-correction matrix. And so some of you may be thinking, well, okay, can't you just use a different pre-correction matrix in order to improve your color rendition? And the answer is unfortunately no, you cannot, because if you use a different pre-correction matrix, you're only changing the relative amounts of the red, the green, and the blue LEDs. And that actually does not enable you to produce light where it doesn't exist in the spectrum of these original primaries. To demonstrate what I mean, we're going to look again at our color chart image here. So we have on the left our target chart, which is under sunlight in this case. And the one on the right, we're looking at a chart photographed inside a calibrated RGB LED virtual production stage. Now, if I sample the pixel values from some of these squares, you can see here that, okay, it's calibrated, so the whites match, which is great. You can click one more. But unfortunately here, the skin tones don't match, and it's a pretty subtle effect. If I now try to calibrate the stage specifically for the goal that the skin tones match, you can see that yes, indeed, I can make the skin tones match. If we go ahead, we'll sample the charts there. And this looks pretty good in practice, except that you'll notice it didn't fix the problem with orange. So not great. So what if I show a more extreme version of this, where I'm saying, okay, now I want to try to match orange. Let's see if I can come up with a new pre-correction matrix that makes orange match. That's the matrix that you would put on the panels in order to make the orange square match. And you can see that, yes, it does match. And unfortunately, when you drive the panels with a calibration matrix to match orange, it means that you get a very yellow cast on the image. And although the effect is very subtle, even for the middle column there, where we were driving it to match the skin tones, we're unfortunately giving a very slight cyan cast to the whole image as well. And so you really don't want to calibrate your virtual production stage so skin tones match, because then your white balance is going to look like cyan. So not a good look. Okay. Next slide. So our key insight in this new work that we're introducing is that we're going to, in addition to having our pre-correction matrix on the panels that's used to pre-correct the content, we're also now going to add a post-correction matrix that we call Q. So it's a 3x3 post-correction matrix. It's a linear transformation. And we're going to apply it to the final image coming out of the camera. The job of the matrix Q is essentially to desaturate the red tones back towards what the reds would look like under your target color rendition properties. And so you can see an example of that happening here. So what's actually going on when we're looking at a 3x3 post-correction matrix for an image? Again, I mentioned it's just a linear transformation. And what ends up happening is that when you start with a particular target spectral sensitivity curve for your camera, if you then introduce a 3x3 post-correction matrix, it enables you to brew up a completely different hypothetical spectral sensitivity curve. In this example that I'm showing here, I've taken green and I've recreated a new green channel for my camera by adding in a small amount of the blue and a small amount of the red channel. And so you can see that I can really spread out the curve of that blue, of the green spectral sensitivity. And so it's pretty cool because with a post matrix, you're essentially pretending that you've got a hypothetical camera you never had. And in the more extreme version of this, you can even create cameras that have negative spectral sensitivities, which is obviously not a camera that you can implement in the real world because you can't record negative light. This is a real Q matrix that we've used, so a real post-correction matrix that we've used for a virtual production shoot. And you can see that it does actually create some negative light in this case. You can go to the next slide. So what does it look like if we go back to our color chart now and we add in our post-correction matrix? So now if we add in the matrix Q, we'll see that okay, we didn't match the colors exactly, but we really did do the job of desaturating the red and the orange back towards what it would look like under a more broad spectrum light source. Okay, but we spent all that time calibrating our in-camera background so it looked correct. So what do we want to do? Now we're saying, okay, well, we're going to apply this post-correction matrix Q to the image, but the whole point of virtual production was that we don't have to do foreground-background segmentation. We don't have to deal with matting or compositing. So if we apply Q to the whole image, then you might be thinking, hey, well, won't that make the in-camera background part look wrong? Because we already corrected that, so and calibrated so that it would look correct. So our kind of key insight here is that we can apply a different matrix to in-frustum versus out-of-frustum content. And so our in-frustum matrix can essentially expect that it's going to be post-corrected and deal with that as part of the calibration process. So in practice, we know that our post-correction matrix Q is going to desaturate the final image. And so what that means is that we need to oversaturate the pixels of the in-camera background so that when we post-correct it, it'll look correct. So instead of applying our original calibration matrix M to the in-camera frustum pixels, we're going to instead apply a new one that we're going to call N, which is M multiplied by the inverse of our post-correction matrix Q. And if we know Q in advance, then we can solve for N very easily. The other thing that's happening here is that the background pixels are not going to contribute very much towards the lighting on the actors. So right now, you don't see me being lit by the light of my presentation. I'm being lit by this, nice set of spotlights here predominantly. And so that means that now the foreground content, as well as the in-camera background content, their appearance is going to be near optimal from a color rendition perspective. So for those who are more visual and don't want to see the big, wall of text that I just had with the equations in front, this is the final look, which is that we have one matrix that's applied to out of frustum content, and this matrix is actually the same one that you would use in traditional in-camera VFX color calibration workflow. We have a different color in frustum pre-correction matrix N, and recall that N is just computed with knowledge of the other two matrices. And then we have a final post-correction matrix Q, which does the job of desaturating the foreground content as well as the background content. Okay. Now, it might seem like, okay, you can just go in and shoot a color chart inside your virtual production stage, and if you have a target color chart in your real-world lighting environment, then you can just easily solve for this matrix Q. But we also introduced a way to, in advance, determine what Q is going to be, just based on knowledge of how a color chart looks when it's lit by each one of the 3 spectral channels that are available inside your virtual production stage. I'm not going to go into the details of that here, so I would refer you to our paper, which was a paper at this year's DigiPro, and you can find it on archive. To test out this approach, to fully validate it, we went out and captured 7 spectrally diverse different lighting environments. 2 of them were outdoors, so 1 in the sun, 1 in the shade. We also had a lot of other different indoor lighting environments with RGB LEDs, indoor kind of warm white LEDs, an inside scene that was being lit with daylight coming in from the windows, as well as a very fun light source, which is a sodium vapor light that has 1 distinct spectral peak at 589 nanometers. It makes the scene look pretty much monochromatic, kind of bathed in yellow light. And in order to display these within the somewhat limited dynamic range of an RGB virtual production stage, we also developed another technique, which was a poster at this year's Siggraph, in order to reduce the dynamic range of the HDRIs to be able to display them properly. Okay. And you can see kind of what that looks like here, where these light sources are essentially dilated. And we're able to maintain the overall light energy in the scene as well as the general directionality, but not have any light sources that are clipped when we display them on the volume. So for validation, Paul and I went outside with our reference spheres, our reference color chart, and our reference Hawaiian shirts. You may see us wearing them at the occasional conference. If so, that's why. So that's the original scene. And then this is driving the whole virtual production stage to make the background pixels look right. And so this is if you use like the current state-of-the-art, color calibration process that just uses the pre-correction matrix. And I will brave backing it up to show the difference here. Okay, that seems to be working. Okay, now if we apply the post-correction matrix, here we're post-correcting the image. And you can see that now the color chart should match more closely to what it was in the original scene. And now this is inverse correcting the background with N, and it's a pretty subtle effect, but it is slightly visible, so I'll back up. You can see slight changes in the background. And now we're also applying a black level subtraction to the in-camera content. And the reason that we're doing this is that the panels themselves have substantial reflectivity, so that whatever lights are being used to light your actors or your subjects in the scene, they're unfortunately also lighting the panels behind the actors. So the panels are going to reflect some of the illumination. And we can do a cool trick where we subtract, we kind of measure in advance how much light we think is going to be bounced off of the panels by the out of frustum content. And then we can subtract that off of the in frustum content in order to get these kind of more vibrant colors. So we can now look at, this is the original scene, and I flip back and forth, you'll see we haven't matched the pose here. The camera angle is not quite right, but the color rendition is generally believable. This is the full process. So the upper left is the target, like in the natural scene. The middle in the top row is the baseline approach, and then our full approach, including the black level subtraction in the lower right. And then I'll flip through the other scenes as well. I clicked. Let's see. So this is the sunlit scene. So for those of you who have practiced virtual production, you probably know that it's very challenging to reproduce the sun inside a virtual production stage, partially because of dynamic range, But in this case, the image of us on the bottom right is trying to reproduce that illumination. You do see some of the simulated sunlight being reflected off the LED panel, so it's not entirely successful, but at least the color rendition is generally believable here. This is now in the indoor daylight afternoon scene. Again, kind of the middle row of the top shows the baseline approach, and our full approach is in the lower right. This is a similar result for the indoor with the warm white LED, as well as for the indoor incandescent source. The next one is a bit interesting. So this is the original target scene here is an RGB LED light source. And then we're, of course, using RGB LEDs inside the virtual production stage to try to reproduce the lighting. So in this case, already looks pretty good to start with. Our post-correction matrix doesn't have to do very much, and it's close to the identity matrix, which is great. So this is the one lighting environment that you can already easily reproduce inside a volume. Now for my favorite example, which is the sodium vapor light source. So on the left, you see this highly monochromatic look because we have light just at 589 nanometers that's being shown. Now you can say, okay, well, let's drive the virtual production stage to try to create that monochromatic light. And what ends up happening is, of course, the stage is going to show a bit of red and a bit of the green LED. But because these two primaries have their broader spectra, you're not actually able to produce that monochromatic light. And so you do end up seeing colors that emerge for the foreground subjects. You'll see that the background looks correct because, again, that's just being produced directly by the panels themselves. Our post-correction technique is able to create that monochromatic look, and you see that in the upper right. But unfortunately here, the post-correction matrix Q is poorly conditioned, and so we're not actually able to invert it to apply the inverse in the background. You can see the full result then in the lower right. All right, so we've basically wrapped it up. We've seen that we can ameliorate some of these color rendition challenges. We have a whole lot of things that we want to do next. We want to do this in live color grading. We want to use more than just RGB LEDs. We want to see this for CG environments because in this example, we were basically just showing HDRIs. And we also want to evaluate kind of mixing in practical lights with virtual production and how this process can apply there as well. Okay, thank you everyone. I want to thank ETC and Eric. Sorry for the technical difficulty in the beginning.
Oh, no worries at all.
Hopefully we have some questions.
Yeah, do we have any questions out there? Because if you don't, I'm going to call on people for some of that math. Anybody?
Yeah.
Oh, I see. Wait.
Hi. Applying the two matrices, one on input and one post, how close to linear image you end up with? Is it close? Like, I'm talking in VFX perspective later on, because you're definitely tilting spectra and like trying to fill up the gaps, you know, with linear matrices. There are different techniques to do that, but it's a clever one. But how close to linear image you end up with?
So the whole imaging process here is linear. So we're ensuring that the panels themselves are displaying light in a linear manner. So linear content in, linear panel display. All of the camera obviously has a linear response when we're looking at it. There's no light that's being clipped on the stage, so the original HDRs are linear, and they're being displayed in this linear system. The pre-correction matrix is a linear transformation. The post-correction matrix is a linear transformation. So there is no non-linearity that's being introduced at any part of the pipeline. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, as long as you save all your negative values if they appear, then there's, yeah.
All right, well, thank you so much. It's wonderful having you again up here,
thanks.
Simon. So we're going to be starting the next session here actually pretty quick. So I'm going to turn it around there. Thank you, Chloe.